remember the exact moment I realized my marriage had become a beautifully furnished cage. It was a Tuesday. George had left for work before dawn again, as usual. But this time he hadn't kissed me goodbye. Not even the dry peck on the forehead that had become our routine. Just the sound of the garage door opening, the purr of his Mercedes fading down the street, and then silence. I stood at our bedroom window watching the sunrise paint the walls gold, my arms wrapped around myself. The house was always too large, too quiet. We'd bought it 10 years ago when George made partner at the firm, dreaming of filling it with children's laughter. But 3 miscarriages and countless fertility treatments later, the extra bedroom sat empty except for when Danny visited. Danny. Even thinking his name sent an illicit thrill through me. George's son from his first marriage was 26 now. Only 12 years younger than me, but he carried himself with a confidence that made the age gap feel insignificant. Where George was all sharp angles and calculated movements, Danny moved through the world like a summer storm. Warm, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. The first time I truly saw him was last Christmas. He'd flown in from Chicago where he was doing his MBA, bringing the scent of snow and expensive cologne into our sterile home. While George buried himself in year-end reports, Danny had helped me cook, his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms dusted with dark hair. "You're using too much cinnamon," he'd murmured, reaching around me to adjust the measurement. His chest pressed against my back for one electrifying second. When I turned to protest, our faces were suddenly inches apart. His eyes, so much warmer than George's cool gray, dropped to my lips. Then the timer went off, and the moment shattered. Now, 6 months later, Danny was back for good, having taken a position at a local firm. He came by every Thursday for dinner, always with a bottle of wine and some excuse about needing George's advice. But I noticed how his gaze followed me around the room, how his fingers lingered when passing me dishes. Last week, I dropped a wine glass. We both knelt to clean it up, his large hands covering mine as we picked up shards. "Careful," he'd said, his voice low. "You'll cut yourself." His thumb brushed my pulse point, and I swear he could feel how fast my heart was racing. When I looked up, his pupils were blown wide, his breathing shallow. The air between us crackled with something dangerous. Then George cleared his throat from the doorway, and Danny sprang back like he'd been burned. That night, lying next to my snoring husband, I replayed those stolen seconds in my mind. My body thrummed with restless energy, my skin still remembering the heat of Danny's touch. For the first time in years, I slipped my hand beneath the waistband of my pajamas, biting my lip to stay quiet as I imagined it was Danny's fingers instead of mine. The guilt came after, sharp and nauseating. I was his stepmother, for God's sake. George's wife. A respectable woman who chaired charity committees and hosted perfect dinner parties. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to George's steady breathing, another traitorous thought crept in. When was the last time George made me feel even a fraction of what just imagining Danny could do? The next morning, I caught myself putting on perfume before Danny's scheduled visit. Just a dab behind my ears. Nothing obvious, that's how it begins, isn't it? The slow unraveling. First the perfume. Then the lower-cut blouses. The longer glances. The accidental touches that aren't really accidents at all. I told myself I was just lonely. That I'd never act on these dangerous thoughts. The Thursday dinners became my secret obsession. I found myself counting down the days, planning menus around Danny's favorite dishes. The rosemary roasted chicken he'd once complimented, the dark chocolate torte that made him groan in appreciation. I told myself it was just hospitality, just being a good stepmother. But when I caught my reflection in the oven door, lips bitten red, eyes bright with anticipation, I couldn't quite believe my own lies. That particular evening, I'd chosen a blouse George had bought me last anniversary. Silk the color of cream, cut just low enough to hint at cleavage without being indecent. I'd spent 20 minutes debating whether to wear my hair up, more sophisticated, or down, softer, more youthful, finally settling on a loose twist with tendrils framing my face. "You look nice," George remarked absently as he poured his usual pre-dinner scotch. He didn't even look up from his phone. The doorbell rang at exactly 7:15. Danny stood on the porch holding 2 bottles of wine, one red, one white, and a bouquet of peonies. "My favorite. These reminded me of you," he said, handing them to me. Our fingers brushed, and I felt the contact like a spark traveling up my arm. Delicate on the outside, but stubborn as hell once they take root. George chuckled from the living room. "She'll outlast us all." But Danny's eyes never left mine. "I don't doubt it." Dinner passed in a haze of wine and dangerous proximity. Danny sat to my right, close enough that every time he reached for the salt, his forearm grazed mine. By the third glass, I noticed how his gaze kept dropping to the exposed skin at my collarbones, how his knuckles whitened around his fork when George mentioned my upcoming girls' trip. "Mary's been needing a break," George said, slicing into his steak. "Haven't you, darling?" Danny's knee bumped mine under the table. "Where are you going?" "Napa Valley," I said, my voice slightly breathless. "Just for 4 days," George finished for me. "Her book club's annual." "Actually," I interrupted, surprising us all, "it got cancelled. I'm going alone." The lie slipped out smooth as the wine in my glass. Danny's eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. George frowned. "Since when?" "Since this morning." I took a deliberate sip of water. "Ellen's daughter went into early labor." A beat of silence. Then Danny's foot pressed against mine beneath the table. Not accidentally. The contact sent a jolt through me so intense I nearly dropped my glass. When I dared to look at him, his expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes, God, his eyes burned with something that made my pulse stutter. After dessert, the chocolate torte of course, George excused himself to take a work call. The moment his study door closed, the air between Danny and me thickened unbearably. "You're a terrible liar," Danny murmured, moving to help me clear the plates. His chest brushed against my shoulder as he reached past me. I turned, suddenly breathless. We stood inches apart in the dim kitchen, the only light coming from the range hood. Up close, I could see the gold flecks in his hazel eyes, the faint stubble shadowing his jaw. He smelled like expensive whiskey and the citrusy cologne I'd secretly bought him last Christmas. "About Napa," I whispered. His gaze dropped to my mouth. "Were you lying about going alone?" My throat went dry. "No." "Good." His hand found mine, our fingers tangling against the stack of plates. "Because I was thinking of visiting wine country next weekend." What a coincidence. The implication hung between us, electric and terrifying. Some rational part of my brain screamed that this was madness, that we were playing with fire. But the rest of me, the part that had been starving for years, leaned into his touch like a desert wanderer finding water. Then the study door creaked open. We sprang apart just as George reappeared, rubbing his temples. "Damn merger's keeping me up all night. Danny, you mind if we cut this short? I need to review these contracts." "Of course." Danny's voice was perfectly even, but his fingers trembled slightly as he handed me the last plate. "I'll see myself out." At the door, while George was distracted by his phone, Danny leaned in close as if to kiss my cheek. His lips never touched my skin, but his whisper sent shivers down my spine. "Text me your hotel confirmation." Then he was gone, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding and the scent of his cologne clinging to my clothes. That night, lying stiffly beside George, I stared at the ceiling until my eyes ached. My phone sat heavy on the nightstand, my fingers itching to reach for it. "1 text." That's all it would take. 1 text, and I could cross a line there'd be no coming back from. T2:17 a.m. I finally picked it up. 3 days later, I stood in front of the floor-length mirror in my Napa hotel room, adjusting the straps of my emerald green sundress for the 10th time. The fabric clung to my hips in a way George had never seemed to notice, but I knew Danny would. My fingers trembled as I smoothed the skirt, my stomach twisting with equal parts guilt and anticipation. A knock at the door froze me mid-motion. I knew it was him before I even looked through the peephole. Could feel it in the way my pulse leapt, the way my skin prickled with awareness. When I opened the door, the sight of him stole my breath. Danny leaned against the doorframe, dressed in a fitted navy button-down that brought out the gold in his hazel eyes. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it. A slow, knowing smile curved his lips as his gaze traveled down my body, lingering on the slit in my dress that revealed far too much thigh. "Hi, Mary." Just my name, spoken in that low, rough voice of his, and I was already unraveling. I stepped aside to let him in, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain he could hear it. The moment the door clicked shut, the air between us thickened, charged with everything we hadn't said, everything we'd been pretending not to feel for months. Danny didn't touch me, not yet. Instead, he prowled around the room, his presence overwhelming in the small space. He stopped by the bedside table, where I'd left a half-finished glass of wine. Without breaking eye contact, he brought it to his lips and drank, his throat working as he swallowed. "You taste sweeter than I imagined," he murmured, setting the glass down. A shiver ran down my spine. Then he closed the distance between us in 2 strides, his hands finding my waist, pulling me against him until I could feel the hard planes of his body, the heat of him even through our clothes. "I've thought about this," he admitted, his breath warm against my ear. "About how you'd feel under my hands. About the sounds you'd make if I touched you the way I've wanted to for years." My knees nearly buckled. His lips brushed the sensitive skin beneath my ear, then trailed down my neck, slow and deliberate. Each kiss was a brand, a claim, and by the time he reached my collarbone, I was clutching his shoulders just to stay upright. "Danny." He silenced me with a searing kiss, his mouth slanting over mine with a hunger that left me dizzy. His tongue swept against my lower lip, coaxing, demanding, and I opened for him with a whimper I didn't recognize as my own. This wasn't like the chaste, perfunctory kisses George gave me. This was consuming. Danny backed me toward the bed, his hands roaming my body with a possessiveness that made my head spin. When the backs of my knees hit the mattress, he didn't push me down. Instead, he dropped to his knees in front of me, his fingers hooking under the hem of my dress. "Tell me to stop," he challenged, his voice roughed. I should have. God knows I should have. Instead, I tangled my fingers in his hair and tugged. Danny's hands slid up my thighs, his calloused palms leaving trails of fire in their wake. When he reached the lace edge of my underwear, he paused, his breath hot against my skin. "You're shaking," he observed, pressing an open-mouthed kiss to my inner thigh. I was shaking, with want, with guilt, with the sheer wrongness of how badly I needed this. How badly I needed him. Then his teeth grazed the sensitive skin just above my stocking, and all coherent thought fled. "Danny." His name spilled from my lips like a prayer as his mouth found the place I ached for him most. My fingers tightened in his hair, my hips arching off the bed as pleasure coiled tight in my stomach. He worked me with lips and tongue and fingers relentless, until my thighs trembled and my breath came in ragged gasps. When I finally broke, shattering around him with a cry he swallowed with another searing kiss, Danny didn't give me time to recover. He stripped off his shirt, revealing toned muscle and sun-kissed skin, and then his hands were everywhere, unbuttoning my dress, tracing the curve of my waist, cupping my breasts with a reverence that made my chest ache. "You're even more beautiful than I dreamed," he admitted against my lips. The confession undid me. I pushed him onto his back, straddling him with a boldness I didn't recognize in myself. His pupils dilated as I rolled my hips against him, drawing a groan from deep in his chest. "Mary," I silenced him with a kiss, my hands roaming the hard planes of his chest, committing every ridge and scar to memory. When I finally took him inside me, we both gasped, the sensation too much and not enough all at once. Danny's hands gripped my hips, guiding me as I moved, his gaze locked on mine with an intensity that stole my breath. With every thrust, the line between pleasure and pain blurred, until I couldn't tell where I ended and he began. When his release came, he buried his face in my neck, muffling my name against my skin like a secret. Afterward, we lay tangled in the sheets, the only sound our ragged breathing and the distant chirp of crickets outside. Danny traced idle patterns on my bare shoulder. "Stay with me." The words hung between us, heavy with meaning. I closed my eyes, the weight of what we'd done, what I'd wanted, settling over me like a shroud. Because I knew, even then, that there was no going back. The car ride back from Napa stretched before us like an endless confession. Danny's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, the silence between us thick with everything we'd done, and everything we hadn't said. I watched the vineyards blur past the window, my body still humming from his touch. The scent of him, whiskey and sweat and sex, lingered on my skin despite 3 frantic showers at the hotel. My phone buzzed in my purse. "George. Asterisk. Did you try the Cabernet you wanted? I'll pick you up at 7 if you're tired from driving." Asterisk. Danny's eyes flicked to my screen. "Still playing the dutiful husband?" His voice was light, but his jaw tightened. I typed back, "No, I'm fine," with trembling fingers. The lie tasted bitter. When we stopped for gas, Danny cornered me against the restroom wall. His hands bracketed my hips, his breath hot against my neck. "Tell me you're not already regretting this." I could feel the evidence of his desire pressed against me. My body remembered exactly what he could do with that hardness. The way he'd pinned my wrists above my head in the hotel, the filthy promises whispered against my damp skin. "I don't regret you," I breathed. "I regret all of this." I gestured between us, at the sticky gas station floor, the flickering fluorescent lights, the reality waiting for us at home. Danny's kiss was punishing. "Too late for second thoughts, Mary." He bit my lower lip hard enough to bruise. You're mine now. George noticed the changes immediately. You're wearing perfume, he remarked that first night back, his nose wrinkling as I bent to kiss his cheek. The strong one. I froze. It was Danny's favorite, the vanilla bourbon scent he'd bought me, just because, last Christmas. The hotel toiletries were overwhelming, I lied, turning away to unpack. Later, in bed, George reached for me. It had been months since he'd initiated, and panic clawed up my throat. I'm exhausted from the drive, I murmured, rolling away. The next morning, I found him studying me over his coffee. You seem different. Just relaxed from the trip. I busied myself scrambling eggs, painfully aware of the bruises hidden under my silk robe, the perfect imprint of Danny's teeth on my inner thigh. Danny's obsession grew reckless. He started appearing everywhere. Leaning against my car after book club, accidentally, bumping into me at the farmer's market. Once, I caught him watching our house from his motorcycle across the street. His sunglasses hiding his eyes but not his smirk when I flushed under his gaze. You're being insane, I texted after he followed me to the dry cleaners. His reply came instantly. Asterisk, you love knowing I can't stay away. Asterisk, I deleted the message. Then pressed my thighs together under my desk, remembering how he'd made me come against that same dry cleaner's wall, his hand clamped over my mouth to keep me quiet. The night everything shattered began ordinarily enough. George was working late. I was in the bath when the doorbell rang. Danny stood dripping on the porch, rain sluicing off his leather jacket. He's not home, I hissed, but he shouldered past me anyway. We didn't make it to the bedroom. He took me right there in the foyer, my back against the wall, my legs wrapped around his waist. That's when the garage door opened. Danny pulled out with a filthy groan, but it was too late. George stood frozen in the doorway, his briefcase slipping from his fingers. The rain lashed against the windows like a warning. I should have locked the door. Danny's hands were still tangled in my hair, his breath hot against my throat, when the garage door groaned open downstairs. We froze, his body still pressed flush against mine, my dress shoved up around my waist, the evidence of what we'd just done slick between my thighs. A heartbeat passed. Then another. The sound of George's footsteps on the stairs was methodical. Unhurried. Like he already knew. Danny pulled away slowly, his pupils blown wide, his lips swollen from my kisses. He didn't bother to adjust himself, just stared at me with a look that said, well, this is what you wanted. The footsteps stopped. I turned. George stood in the foyer, his suit perfectly pressed, his briefcase dangling forgotten from one hand. His eyes moved from my disheveled hair to Danny's unbuttoned jeans to the smeared lipstick on both our mouths. For one excruciating moment, no one spoke. Then George set his briefcase down with terrifying precision. 16 years, he said, his voice eerily calm. Was it ever real? My throat closed. I wanted to lie, to fall to my knees and beg forgiveness, but the words wouldn't come. Danny stepped forward, buttoning his pants with deliberate slowness. She hasn't been happy for a long time, Dad. The word Dad hung in the air like a grenade with a pin pulled. George flinched as if struck. When he spoke again, his voice cracked. How long? I swallowed hard. Napa was the first time. The first time? George let out a hollow laugh. Christ. Mary. You're still lying. He reached into his breast pocket and threw a stack of photos at my feet. Security footage from the hotel. Danny pressing me against the elevator wall, my hands fumbling with his belt in the hallway, us stumbling into the room, my dress already half off. Danny picked one up, studying it with something like pride. You hired a PI? Classy. George moved faster than I'd ever seen. 1 second he was across the room, the next, his fist connected with Danny's jaw with a sickening crack. Danny staggered back, blood blooming at the corner of his mouth. Then he smiled. That all you got, old man? They crashed into the hall table, sending a vase shattering to the floor. George got in 2 more hits before Danny retaliated, a brutal uppercut that sent George sprawling into the wall. Stop! I screamed, throwing myself between them. Danny caught my wrist, his grip bruising. He was never enough for you. Admit it. George wiped blood from his lip, his eyes never leaving mine. Is that true? The silence stretched. Then very quietly George said, Get out. Danny tugged me toward the door. You don't have to. I wasn't talking to you. George's voice broke. Mary. Go. And just like that, 16 years of marriage ended with a whisper. For a moment, the world stopped. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked once. Twice. The rain outside had turned to a quiet hush, as if even the storm was holding its breath. George didn't yell. He didn't cry. He just stood there, blood dripping from his split lip, his chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. His wedding ring caught the dim light as he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Danny's fingers tightened around my wrist. "Mary," he said, low and urgent. I looked at George. Really looked at him. The man who had held my hand through 3 miscarriages. Who had warmed my cold feet between his calves every winter for 16 years. Who had loved me quietly, steadily, even when I stopped loving him back. And I knew. I pulled my arm from Danny's grip. His face darkened. Asterisk. "What are you doing?" Asterisk. I didn't answer. I walked to the hall closet, took out my coat, then reached for the small suitcase I kept for weekend trips. George watched me, his expression unreadable. Danny let out a disbelieving laugh. Asterisk. "You're seriously choosing him?" Asterisk. I turned to face him. "No," I said softly. Asterisk. "I'm choosing me." Asterisk. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. I bought a cottage by the sea. It's small. Just 1 bedroom, a kitchen that smells like salt and herbs, and a garden where I'm learning to grow peonies. The first time I saw them bloom, I cried. George sends a check every month. I never cash them. Danny showed up once, drunk and furious, pounding on my door until the neighbors threatened to call the police. He left a single rose on my porch. I let the tide take it. Some mornings, I wake up and reach for someone who isn't there. But then I make coffee, sit on the porch, and watch the sunrise paint the waves gold. And for the first time in years, I breathe. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of love, passion, and adventure.